All right, good morning, everyone. My name is McKenna Julian. I'm an Ag and Natural Resources educator out of Lincoln County. I'm based out of Kenner.
My name is Dagan Montgomery. I'm an extension educator as well, based out of Sumner County, Pinedale.
So Chance asked us to talk a little bit today about some backgrounding beef calves, some management decisions, and some nutrition protocols on it. So if you guys have questions along the way, please feel free to interrupt. You will not hurt our feelings. I'd rather answer it as you have them instead of you forget them. So what the heck is backgrounding? It's not a super common practice in Wyoming, but especially up around Riverton and a few other areas, we do see it. It's basically raising and managing calves after weaning, but before they're going into the feedlot. And really, you're trying to target the use of inexpensive feeds in order to grow these calves and develop an immune system, get them ready to go into that lot. Okay? Go ahead.
So I was going to say, does anybody in here background already? Is this something anybody's familiar with?
So backgrounding is one of those time periods with cattle that you can do it for a few weeks or you can do it for months, kind of whatever you need, whatever feed stuff you have, your availability, as well as how long you need to wait until they go into the lot. The diet typically consists of high quality forage, pasture, hay, silage, if you've got access to cover crops or something like that, and some concentrates. Generally, weight gain is going to be anywhere between 1.5 and 2.5 pounds a day, depending how long you're going to hold them and how hard you need to push them. And we're looking at putting on muscle, not fat at this point. So calves typically range anywhere between 400 and 800 pounds during this period. And you typically would want a pretty substantial health program. You want to make sure you're vaccinating and worming them well at this point before they're going into an actual lot. So really, what's the point? Why am I going to hold these calves longer and feed them longer? You're trying to add weight and add money. If you can add weight and condition to those calves pretty cheap, it could pan out for you on the back end. As well as you're adjusting them to a feedlot environment. It's pretty shocking to take a calf from a pasture and throw them right into a lot. They typically don't perform super well, just from the shock of trying to learn how to eat out of a bunk, where the water is, whatnot. So you should use this for more than just waiting out the market. You need to consider, do I have the feed, do I have the facilities, whatnot. So you probably hear the term background versus stalker thrown around kind of interchangeably. They are different, but there are times they are pretty much the same. Backgrounders are typically associated with a dry lot or some sort of confinement system. So you're basically putting them into a feedlot, but you're not feeding them a high energy finishing diet. Northern states where, other than this year, snow is covering pastures, we typically look at a dry lot situation for backgrounding. Stalkers are often thought of more on the pasture or range side. Maybe you're getting some yearlings in and you've got a ton of extra grass, so you're going to dump them out and just put some cheap weight on them. They can be used interchangeably. It really depends where you're at, who you're talking to. But basically, at the end of the day, you're just trying to put weight on as cheap as possible. So you might consider backgrounding your stocker. If you have a ton of extra feed resources. So around here, if you've got access to some cheap feed, maybe it's some corn silage, or you've got access to some pasture that you can background on, great. You get on the west or the east side of the state, and a lot of times you'll see people backgrounding on cover crops, plant some oats or something after corn harvest, and it's cheap feed. If the market at weaning is not favorable, you might want to at least talk to our livestock marketing specialist and see, is it worth, is the market supposed to pick up in the spring? Is it worth me holding them, feeding them a little bit, and targeting the market better? As you're selling calves to different feed yards, there's some yards that prefer a backgrounded calf. Again, they come in, they're not half done because they don't know how to eat out of a bunk. They've got a little more weight on them, typically a little healthier at that point, whatnot. You can also kind of bring together those mismanaged cattle. So maybe it's the tail end of your calves you're going to keep, and their weights are all over the board, half of them look mangy, whatnot. It's a way of kind of bringing them into a more uniform group before you sell them, okay? And since cattle can be on feed for several months, they can, by backgrounding calves, you can actually hit the preference of certain buyers. So instead of, all our calves going into feedlots at the same time, we can kind of target so we have a cycle throughout the entire year this way. So, what are the pros? Because there's pros and cons to everything we do in ag. You have more time to recapture those preconditioning costs, okay? You have the ability to market outside of the seasonal calf run. You can take advantage of homegrown feeds, and you have more pounds to sell. Pounds pay at the end of the day, right? There are challenges. Initially, your calves are probably gonna lose weight. Take them off mom, you wean them, you throw them in a dry lot, they're gonna lose weight to start. You're gonna do the same thing in a lot. So you will have that. Difference in weaning protocols. So if you're gonna go buy, maybe you're gonna go buy a bunch of later born calves and kind of put together a little pen to background yourself. You've got different weaning protocols. Some are vaccinated, some weren't. Some were fence line weaned, some were ripped right off mom, whatever. So you'll see some differences in stress and illness due to that. There is a high cost of gain to start. So because those calves come in and basically go off feed and lose weight initially, you're gonna have a higher cost to put that weight back on them. But eventually, if you background long enough, it will should level out, as long as your feed's not super expensive. And then market variability. Rob might have the crystal ball and tell you, hold on to those calves next spring, the market's gonna be amazing, whatnot. And then something crazy in the world happens, and Rob couldn't predict it, but the calf market went in the tank. So ag is full of risk. This is another risk that you're taking. So it's a balance of trying to mitigate the risk, okay? Calf value is impacted by a lot of things. What's their weight? How much do they weigh? What's their sex? How uniform is your lot? You have black calves and white calves and red calves, and half of them look like they just came off the mountain, and half of them look like they've been in a feed lot. They will sell worse than a really uniform. If they all look like they came out of the same cookie cutter, they're gonna sell better. Animal health. Color and breed does play a factor. Condition and things like, do they have horns? Are they crazy? Do they have a really bad disposition and they're wilder than heck? And then information does pay. So do they come from a verified program? Were they vaccinated at weaning? How were they managed prior to you receiving them? Okay? Or on the back end, when you go to sell them, the more information you've got, and you can say these are how these cattle have been managed, will pay better for you. Okay, so we talked about there's a difference in dry lotting and pasture. So dry lotting is really a confined feeding situation. There's a designated area, there's not grazing. It's essentially a feed lot. We do have quite a few dry lots around Wyoming. There's quite a few here in Fremont County. These can offer benefits in the winter. On a normal winter, when we have snow and it's nasty, you have easier access to your cattle, it's easier to feed, easier to monitor, they're not out having to work for it. You can typically, imagine you got 50 calves and they're in a dry lot. It's a lot easier to tell which one's sick, than out in a pasture and you couldn't even find them. So you can dial in their feed a little easier because you're providing all of it. So you can manage that side of it a lot better. You can control step-up programs, so you can decide, I'm gonna start stepping these calves up so they start to gain more quicker, versus if they're out in a pasture, it's a little more difficult to do. And then the idea of acclimating them to a bunk. There's a lot of calves that have never seen a bunk before going to a feedlot, and it's a new world for them to try to learn how to eat out of a bunk right next to their brothers, figure out where the water is, fight over it. So if you're gonna have a dry lot, biggest thing, especially farming, has to be well drained. This year might not be so bad, but 2 winters ago we got all that snow. Feedlots were a muddy, muddy mess, which just leads to disease and hoof rot and everything else. You have to have a waste management plan. What are you gonna do with all that manure? You have to have 18 to 24 inches of bunk space per animal. So if you had a bunk that goes across, think of it, each calf needs 18 to 24 inches in order to stick his head to eat. So you can't fill one pen with 1,000 calves, even if they'll all fit. It's all based on how many feet of bunk space you have, okay? Not usually an issue in most of Wyoming, but Fremont County gets hot, and shade is pretty important. If you're backgrounding calves in a dry lot during the summer, that heat stress will cause them to go off feed. You'll have decreased gains and poor performance. Think about where your chutes and pens are placed, and then how are you gonna get feed to them? You need a feed truck, you need a mixer. How's that gonna work, okay? Now, if you're gonna do more the stocker side, the grazing, really this depends on the pasture. You have grass, right? It's a less intensive system. Instead of having to get in and feed those calves every single day, their feed's right there with them. You might be supplementing a little bit, but you're not having to mix rations all day. It can be cheaper, depending on your scenario. There are challenges. You need to consider forage management and make sure that you're maximizing the grass that you have. It's not getting wasted, or you're not leaving some behind, or damaging your pastures. Typically, cattle in a grazing situation like this, when they come out, are less uniform than those are in a dry lot situation. Timing forage in Wyoming between weaning and marketing can be difficult. On a normal year, we typically have several inches of snow on the ground. And so, trying to time, do I have grass, do I not have grass? Can I put them out? Can be a little difficult. And then you will need to do some supplementing, whether that's every 3 days you're providing some protein and energy or whatnot, but you will have to take those considerations into it. So, Fremont County is kind of lucky compared to most of Wyoming because we have a lot more options for feed sources. Corn stalk residue and winter ranges are a lot easier to graze here than, say, Pinedale. There's not any corn in Pinedale. Corn stalk residue can be very economical for a producer to graze. Typically, it's pretty cheap. However, it's lower protein and energy. There's not a whole lot out there for them to eat besides some fiber and whatever corn's left behind. So you'll have to supplement for sure protein and probably an energy source as well. If you have cover crops, maybe you're gonna plant cover crops after corn harvest, or your neighbor is and you can graze them. Planting winter annuals can provide a really high quality feed. There is some variability in, it's a little more difficult to determine how much they're gonna eat, how many days you can graze based on what's out there. Part of my research in grad school looked at just this, grazing oats after corn silage harvest, and man, we'd have it down to a science. We can put 40 calves out on this little meadow for 20 days. And there were some years they made it 9 before the feed was gone, and there were other years we made it 40 days before it was gone. So you really need to watch to evaluate how much forage you have if you're gonna graze cover crops. A TMR, or total mixed ration in a dry lot, this is gonna integrate if you have a farming and a livestock practice. I have some friends here in town that they put up corn and they have a feed lot. So they're actually utilizing their corn silage and dry corn in their lot in order to background their calves. Silage and distillers grains are typically cheaper than hay, not always, but a lot of years it's cheaper. And your intake and performance can be better controlled. So if you're gonna feed them a mixed ration, say here's your oatmeal basically every morning, this is what you get, they're gonna do better performance-wise than if they're having to pick their own lunch. Try to source local cheap feeds. I mean, don't feed them the junk, but we're not trying to pay through the nose in order to throw a little bit of weight on these calves, okay? So use what's available and get kind of creative with it. As long as it's economical and it should put weight on calves, it would be a good option, okay? Byproducts, winter pastures, if they hop the fence and we graze the neighbor's place, that works too. All right,
so now we're gonna talk about what you're doing if you're actually getting these calves in. Whether you're receiving calves, bringing them off the mom or out of the pasture, and this is more of a dry lot scenario where you're feeding them concentrates to kind of get some weight on these guys. So the main thing is what you do not want to do is bring them straight off the cow or bring in an animal that's been grazing or receiving low quality hay and just start throwing the grain concentrate to them. That's when we start to see some digestive upsets, bloat, issues like that, because their gut's not ready for it. And not only that, they just don't know how to eat yet out of the bunk, like we talked about a little bit. So what you want to do is kind of gradually increase that and adapt both their rumen and themselves to feeding a concentrate. So that could look like, this is a pretty intense version of this. This would be a pretty intense background scenario, but this is just an example. At the beginning, you're going to want to continue to provide them forage to decrease that digestive issue, and always provide some kind of forage, some kind of roughage that they're able to break down. And there is some research that tells us creep feeding calves early on when they're still on the cow can kind of help prepare them for this. So this is just an example. Up here we have the percentage of body weight and concentrate that they would be eating across this program, 1% to 2.5%, and some average weight. So let's say we have 4 lots of calves, 5 weights, 550s, 6 weights, and 650s, just to show you what this is going to transition to compared to the weight of the calf. So day 1, they're coming in, at most, we probably want to start at about 1% body weight grain, the rest being hay and forage. You can even start lower than that if you really want to be careful. By day 3 to 6, so kind of that first week, you can jump that up to 1.5%. Within that by the end of that first week, closer to 2%, and then the goal is by the end of 2 weeks or so, have them up to where you'd want them eating 2.5% of their body weight and some kind of concentrate or high energy feed. So to go over real quick some basic health management stuff, the main thing here is to work with your vet, talk to them and see what they would like you to do. If you're receiving calves, it's really important to vaccinate upon arrival, especially if you don't know their history or you know they haven't been vaccinated. Castration and dehorning, it's a good idea to do this at least 2 weeks before weaning, but the big thing here is if you're buying bull calves off somebody that didn't castrate, it's not as common nowadays, but you still might get into that situation. Let them acclimate a little bit before you run them through and try to castrate them. Give them a week or 2 to kind of acclimate and get over that initial stress of entering the lot. And then basic parasite treatment. This can be a big issue in a confined feeding operation. So some deworming and external treatment can really help overall stress once they get in that feed lot. Because if they're stressed from parasites, disease, if you have bulls in there running around, that's going to increase the overall stress and decrease their ability to go eat that good feed and put weight on. So this is kind of just a general vaccine protocol and booster protocol for receiving calves into a background situation. So again, work with your vet. Don't take my word for it. I'm definitely not a vet. But a basic IBR, BVD, a parainfluenza, something for a respiratory, and then a 7-way clostridial. This is when it can be really nice to keep really good records. You should always keep records, but if you're ear tagging, writing down numbers, you can really record which calves were treated, which calf got sick and had to be treated again. Maybe there's a problem calf that just keeps getting sick and that kind of thing. So testing feed, this is my bread and butter. I probably annoy my colleagues because it's all I talk about. But this is crucial in my opinion. I think it should be done all across the beef industry. I try to get my calf guys to do as much as possible, but especially in a background situation where you have control of the feed because they're either getting hay or concentrates, and you really need these animals to put weight on in a timely manner. It's crucial. You cannot take the source of word for what the feed quality is. Not that they're lying to you, they just might not know themselves that well. So testing both hay and concentrate feed really tells you what key nutrients might be insufficient in that diet, where you can supplement. Also can tell you where you don't need to supplement so you can avoid putting that money into it. Because if you don't know what's in your feed, if you're not providing sufficient energy, you're not going to be able to overcome the cost of getting that feed to them in the first place. So protein, this is the one everybody's kind of familiar with. We know protein's important in our feed. If we're testing for anything, if we could pick one thing to test for in feed, most people would probably pick protein. But not all protein is the same in our feeds. It varies tremendously based on the source and a lot of different things. But the main thing is metabolizable protein is all the protein that animal can utilize that's comprised of the microbes in the rumen in that first compartment of the stomach that are actually breaking down the fiber. The animal actually can pass those along to be digested as a protein source, as well as rumen undegradable protein. So that is also called bypass protein, but essentially that's just the protein that isn't broken down in the rumen by those microbes and goes on to the small intestine. And it's available directly to the tissue of the animal there. And that's our most efficient way for an animal to digest protein. When energy is sufficient, that RUP, or undegradable protein, is what goes to developing the muscle and the skeletal growth that we want in background of calves without putting too much weight on, too much fat on. You don't want an overly fat calf by the time you're done, because the feedlot's not gonna wanna do, there's not as much they can do with it to get it ready for slaughter at that point. So that RUP is what's really critical for muscle and structural growth in those calves. This little diagram just kind of breaks it down. So that's our degradable protein and non-protein nitrogen. So that's what we can feed urea to ruminants. That all goes into crude protein. That's what's broken down by the microbes. Then you have the RUP that is going to bypass the microbes. It's not burning up energy, and it's going directly into the small intestine. So to kind of break down why this metabolizable protein matters and how this affects a growing calf a little bit differently. For maintenance, we have a 500-pound calf and a 700-pound calf. To not gain any weight, of course we don't want that to happen, but just to keep them at the same weight, a 500-pound calf needs about 240 grams a day of metabolizable protein, whereas a 700-pound calf needs 300, which makes sense that 700-pound calves are bigger, right? But, oops, sorry. If we want them to really gain, now, to preface this, this is a pretty intense amount of gain. This is based on Iowa research. They have Iowa genetics, so their calves might be able to gain 3.5 pounds a day. But if that's our goal, that 500-pound calf has to eat 795 grams of metabolizable protein a day, whereas the 700-pound calf only has to eat 775. So a 20-gram difference, and the reason for that is that 500-pound calf has a higher requirement to keep putting on weight. It's earlier on in its development phase, so it actually needs more protein to gain the same amount of weight. So to kind of compare, again, we talked a lot about crude protein, but that's not all we should be considering, because crude protein might be great, but the RUP, the undegradable protein, can vary quite a bit between our feedstuffs. So corn, for instance, it's not a protein source we really consider. I mean, 8% crude protein, we don't really feed corn for protein. But of that 8%, 64% is undegradable protein that's going to pass right to the small intestine. So if we think about more of a typical protein supplement, let's say soybean meal, 48%, almost half of that is crude protein, really good protein, but only 45% of the crude protein is undegradable. The rest is going to be broken down and require energy to grow. That's why people like distillers grains so much. They're pretty dang high in crude protein, and a good amount of that crude protein that is available is undegraded. It's going to pass on to the small intestine and help, it's going to be a little bit more efficient on putting on muscle. So byproduct feeds, that's something that's become really popular in the last few decades as those have become more available and we've gotten to know a little bit more about them. They can be extremely economical if you have a good way to source those, but you have to consider them because there's a lot less uniformity with these byproduct feeds. So distillers and corn gluten are great. They're high in energy and crude protein, but they're also really high in phosphorus, or they can be at least. So a mineral supplement, if you're providing some kind of supplement, a lot of the times you're not going to want to add any additional phosphorus into that supplement, or feed some kind of alternative cheap source of calcium. And the reason for that is you want that calcium to phosphorus ratio that they're getting into their system to be at least 1.5 to 1 or greater. A lot of people will tell you 2 to 1, calcium to phosphorus. Because if they have too much phosphorus in their system, not enough calcium, that phosphorus prevents them from uptaking that calcium. That's where we run into issues like urinary calculi, or what you might have heard as water belly. Condensed solubles is another one that's become a little bit more popular. That is, or also known as distiller syrup. It's a liquid, really high moisture content. But on a dry matter, when we remove the water, it's also really high in energy and protein. However, it has a high sulfur content. So in general, because of that sulfur content, you want to limit that to no more than 1/3 of their overall intake per day. It can also be a good idea to include some kind of copper in their mineral supplement if they're eating a lot of distiller syrup, because copper can kind of help inhibit that sulfur from becoming toxic. Sugar beet pulp, I know we have a lot of sugar beets up in the basin. These might be something that's pretty available to you. They're super highly digestible. They can really break that stuff down in their system. Really high in TDN or energy. However, the protein in sugar beet pulp is really variable. It can be as low as 6.6% all the way up to almost 12%. So again, make sure you're taking the samples of that feed to test it. Again, keep in mind that dry matter is really low, only about 24%. So because there's so much moisture in it, you're going to want to limit that to probably no more than 30% of their total intake for the day. The key to all of this though, because of the variability, is sample. Sample, sample, sample all of your feedstuffs that you come in when you can. It's really economical. I think it's, for a basic NIR test, it's like $20 to $30 per sample that you ship into a lab. And you can kind of vary what they're testing, but make sure you're testing for, of course, energy and protein, but also some of our macro minerals. So again, as a rule, byproducts vary widely based on the source. Even between batches of the same plant, there can be a big variability. They're not as uniform as the commercial feeds we might go get from the feed store. And that undegradable protein can vary even between batches that have the same crude protein level. And again, like we were talking about with calcium and phosphorus, certain minerals, when they're too high, can interrupt the uptake of the other key minerals in the diet. There's some really cool ration balancing software that a couple different universities have. I'm partial to this one. This is Oklahoma State's calculator, spelled C-O-W because Dr. Ullman thinks he's hysterical. But this one you can download online for free. It's an Excel spreadsheet. And we don't have internet today, but I'll show you kind of what that would look like if you were interested in that. Another one is the Iowa Beef Ration and Nutrition software. I haven't used that one, but I've heard a lot of good things. There's some other ones that do require a subscription and payment that are also good. I know there's one out of Canada that people have used with pretty good luck. So a lot of these software systems kind of have the same overall layout, but for Oklahoma State's, you have a page that shows you your cow information. So this is where you would put in growing and finishing cattle if you're backgrounding, how many days you plan to have them on feed, and then the main thing here is their initial weight, what they're weighing when they come in, and where you want them to be, what you want them to be at before they're shipped off. You can even include breed, because it varies a little bit. Were they implanted? Are they receiving an ionophore? And their body condition when they're coming into the lot. So then, I know it's a lot of numbers, it's hard to see from back there, but I didn't include this, I should have, but the feed list has a lot of listed out feeds with their nutrient quality in them. Just keep in mind, those are based off, that's Oklahoma data, so even the stuff that we share in common with Oklahoma might vary a little bit. So that's when, if you test your own feed, you can take that data that you get back from the lab and plug it into this feed list and use your own feeds with the exact nutrient data you get. Then you can play around with the numbers here of pounds of each feed they're going to be receiving, and it's going to tell you, are you adequate with all of your minerals, energy, and protein? Are you excessive, which is really important. So if you're excessive, when it's yellow, that just means you're getting more than they need. But if, say, we're feeding distillers and that sulfur is super high, dangerously high, over here it's going to turn red and tell you toxic, so you know that you're feeding too much sulfur. It'll also tell you what you can expect them to gain on this amount of feed that they're eating. And it takes a little bit of playing around with, I won't lie, but once you get this working out, figured out, it can be a really good way to see if what feed you have available in a certain batch is going to promote the growth you're looking for. And then this is even a mixing sheet that they throw in if you have the ability to mix your feeds. It tells you how much of each would go with that batch. So anyway, if you have any questions about this kind of stuff or other software, just reach out to one of us and we can help you out. So growth implants, a lot more popular now, but there's still plenty of calves that come in that have never received a growth implant. But even if they've not been implanted in the pasture on the cow, doesn't mean you don't have time to make up for that in the backgrounding situation. So the purpose of an implant is to enhance their overall performance, but what this really does is it delays fat deposition, keeps them from gaining too much fat on a high energy diet, and increases that lean tissue, so muscle and frame growth. There's a really good economic return on implants, anywhere from $5 to $15 additional gain per dollar you spend on the implants themselves. And the gains with implanted calves are 10 to 20% over calves that aren't implanted. So which implant you pick, there's a bunch that you can choose from. It really depends on the expected rate of gain, how intense you want them to be gaining, market timing, how long that period is, and a big thing is age, weight, and genetics. So the plan of nutrition, it's really important to remember, you have to have them on a good high nutrient diet to make use of the implant. Just keeping them on some low quality grass or hay with an implant is not gonna make that big of a difference. If there's really a limited benefit to an implant if they're gaining less than a pound a day. So that's why we would use it in a background situation where we're trying to get a little bit more out of them. Compensatory gain is something to keep in mind. That means if an animal is gaining low previously in its life, you can kind of offset that with a higher energy diet when it comes into the background situation. Another thing to keep in mind is if there's a chance any of the animals in that group might be retained for breeding, either as breeding bulls or replacement heifers, be careful how you implant them if you do it all. Just make sure you're following those label instructions because only certain implants are approved for reproductive animals. This is just a big chart, all of our trade name implants, the company that makes them. And the main thing here is this shows if they're approved for background or stocker steers versus heifers. So some implants that are approved for steers are not approved for heifers and vice versa. Not to say they won't work, but I'm not going to tell you to do that because it means the research that was done to get them approved was using either steers or heifers and not both. So, but there are a few that you can use in either steers or heifers. Ionophores are another really neat thing that people need to consider when they're thinking about backgrounding calves. This is something we kind of normally think about being pushed off to the finishing phase, but it can definitely be impactful during backgrounding as well. So what an ionophore does is it inhibits specific microbes in their stomach, in their rumen, and it basically changes how they ferment that fiber, that feed that's getting into them to improve the energy, so how well they're able to gain off of it, the overall efficiency. It really helps with energy metabolism and overall energy retention in that feed. It reduces rumen protein breakdown, which is a really key thing. Like we talked about earlier, if you can get protein to pass on to the small intestine, it's going to be able to help them gain a little bit more efficiently. So it changes the rumen or the micropopulation that would otherwise break down protein. And overall, it's going to help reduce coccidiosis, acidosis, bloat, and some other health issues we see in a background situation. So overall, feed efficiency typically increases anywhere from 3 to 10%, depending on the level of energy in the diet, and they can be super cost effective. At 2 cents a day, per head per day. And again, they work as a good coccidiostat if that's something you've had to deal with, especially like in a dry lot situation. So just to keep in mind for a more forage-based stopper backgrounding program, proper ionophore levels are extremely important when they're on low-quality forage. If you have too much ionophore, if you're feeding too much ionophore on a low-quality diet, it's going to inhibit their ability to further digest that and break it down. So because more is passing on through the rumen, they're not able to get as much as they should out of that low-quality stuff. So you got to make sure your protein and energy levels are optimum to optimize the ionophore's effect. So when we throw implants and ionophores together is when we really see a big impact in the overall change. When they're used together, they're 100% additive. They work together to further improve the growth of that animal. So if we have an animal or a group of steers that has no implant or an ionophore, they're gaining about 2.3 pounds a day. If we just implant those steers, that's going to increase to 2.71 pounds a day, about 0.42 pounds increase. If we're just using an ionophore, it's going to increase to 2.49 or a 0.2 pound increase. But if we can use an implant as well as an ionophore at the same time in those growing steers, they gain overall 2.89 pounds a day. So an overall increased return of $42 per steer versus not implanting or ionophore. So keep in mind with all this nutrition, it's really a balancing act. Just because you have a cheap feed source doesn't mean you're actually getting the most out of that. Doesn't mean it's the most economically effective. So if we have 3 diets, a low energy diet, a moderate, kind of medium, middle of the road energy diet, and a high energy diet, so that percent concentrate, the percent of grain or a byproduct overall, it's going to be 25%, 40%, and 60%. And What that means is the lower energy is leading to lower gains, so 1.5 pounds a day versus 2.2 or 2.7 pounds a day. Because this is a lower energy diet, their ability to convert that feed to a pound of gain is less. So it's going to take 10 pounds of this feed to gain a pound, 7.5 pounds of this feed to gain a pound, and 5.8 pounds of this feed to gain a pound. And when you pencil that out, even though this might be cheaper by the ton, the cost of gain, the cost that's actually taken to put that extra weight on the animal, is $1.35 versus a higher energy diet is only 93 cents. So again, the price per ton does not equal the cost of gain. Here's an example of some hay. We have 50% energy hay and a 63% energy hay. This is a little lower quality, so it's $1.25 a ton. This is $1.80 a ton. So a good amount more. But because this is lower in energy, these calves are gaining 2.5 pounds a day versus 2.9 pounds a day on the higher energy feed. That doesn't seem like a lot, just 0.4 pounds a day, but if we pencil it out, the feed to gain ratio is 5.85 compared to 5.14, and with that price per ton, it's costing 87 cents per pound to put weight on these calves versus only 85 cents a pound to put weight on these calves, even though we're spending more at the beginning for the hay. So I got a lot of different examples of some different feed mixes here just to kind of show you how this cost of gain can vary. We don't have to go through all of them exactly, but let's just say we have some decent grass hay available and we can get wheat midds for a good price. So it's 13 pounds of grass hay, 7 pounds of wheat midds. They're gaining 2 pounds a day. That's about 59 cents per pound of gain on each of those animals. Whereas if we have grass hay and wheat midds, and we're increasing the wheat midds to 12 pounds, decreasing that hay to 8 pounds, including some limestone supplement, because overall these wheat midds aren't going to have a great calcium source. The feed cost of gain goes down to 0.47 cents a pound. Again, so we talked about corn silage availability a little earlier. So let's say we have some good alfalfa hay at 8 pounds a day and some corn silage we can feed up to 19 pounds a day. Now remember that corn silage is pretty high in moisture, so it's going to take more as fed to meet the requirements. That's 69 cents a pound versus if we include a little bit of lower quality grass hay instead of just alfalfa and throw some corn grain and wheat midds through them at 6 pounds each, they're going to gain 3 pounds a day, and that's only going to cost you 0.47 cents a pound. Again, I have 2 more of these, not to bore you, but if we're feeding alfalfa hay and corn grain at 13 and 7 pounds respectively, that's 67 cents a pound versus alfalfa hay at 5.5 pounds, 13 pounds of corn, so a lot of corn. Let's say corn's cheap that year, and some kind of protein supplement to make sure they're getting their protein. That's going to only cost you 54 cents a pound. Again, like I talked about, distillers grains, they're really increasing in popularity. They're a great source, high in energy and protein. We're feeding 15 pounds of grass hay and 5 pounds of distillers grain, almost $0.75 per pound of gain in that situation. But if we include a little bit of corn grain and some limestone just as a calcium supplement, at 7 pounds of corn, that drops down to almost 50 cents a pound. So this is when you really got to figure out what your rate of gain goals are. How much do you want your calves to be gaining every day in the background situation? The goal isn't to just get as much weight on those guys as possible, all right? So less than 2 pounds of gain a day is pretty realistic for a lot of people. That's a relatively low rate of gain for a growing calf, but this might work really well for a grass cattle market if they're just eating a forage diet. It might also suit you well if you have an extended stopper program. So if you're going to be grazing from weaning until the following summer or fall throughout the summer, this might be a good option to shoot for. So 2 to 3 pounds a day is kind of a medium rate. That's kind of a typical background rate of gain. So this is a kind of a sweet spot. This grows calves without adding too much condition or fat. The key in the backgrounding phase, again, is muscle deposition, muscle growth over fat growth. You don't want a little butterball going in to be sold to the feedlot because at that point they're getting close to where they're not going to be able to do a whole lot with it by feeding them themselves. You want something that's got muscle and frame that the feedlot themselves can add that fat At over 3 pounds a day, average daily gain, that's a really high rate of gain in a background situation. You really want to be careful in this situation because you might be putting on too much fat. And you're just going to reduce your overall feedlot performance later on. Some cattle are just genetically disposed to be able to gain a much higher rate without putting too much fat on, without suffering performance or grading loss once they get to the feedlot and slaughter. Out here, I think a lot of our genetics are going to be more range type genetics where this medium rate of gain is going to suit us better. Back east, where they have some really high weight gain genetics in their herds, they might be able to get away with a greater than 3 pounds a day average daily gain without putting too much fat on. So the factors that keep in mind, I'm definitely not an economist, but Rob helped me work through this a little bit. The cost of gain, again, is that feed cost per day divided by the average daily gain. So how much does it cost you to put a pound of gain onto each animal? And then the value of gain is the final value minus what the initial value of the animal times the overall pounds of weight you were able to put on that situation. The key is you have to make sure the value that you have gained on those animals is higher than the cost of gain. So now I'm going to get this over.
Neither one of us are economists. I'll preface that. Rob Ziegler is our new livestock marketing specialist at the university, and a numbers guru. He does not hold a crystal ball, so don't run up to him afterwards and ask all the decisions you should make, but he's pretty savvy with helping you at least look at all the options. So we threw together some marketing considerations. This presentation was originally developed for a meeting in November, and so we were looking at, what if I sold my calves right now in November? Or what if I held them till April? Or what if I held them till June? So the numbers still stand pretty good, right, Rob? You took a peek at them? They're a little shaky?
Don't get bogged down in numbers, who's knows about these things?
Okay. So basically what this is looking at is I've got 100 head, and if I'm gonna sell them in November, in November, they weigh 575 pounds, okay? And in November, price we could have got was 307. That was based on that time period, okay? Versus April, they're gonna weigh 802 after I've put some weight on them, and they're only worth 260, okay? And then there's costs associated with all this. So you decide to keep a calf, money's gonna be going out of your checkbook for different things, right? So we were looking at trying to do 1.5 pounds per day of gain. We've got calves on corn stalks, and so we've got a rate. What's it gonna cost us? Even if we own those corn stalks, it's gonna cost us because we could be leasing them out or whatnot. So that's at $850. And then we're gonna supplement with some distillers grains at $216 a ton as fed, okay? We have some trucking to get them from our field to the sale barn. And then we have our depth loss, things die, it happens, and we have a cost for an implant here. So it's a rough idea of, if you decide to background, these are some of your inputs that will have to come out of your chicken.
Also tax implications there too, jumping years.
Yeah. And Rob's not quite a tax expert, so I didn't let him get into that, but probably by next year, I'll work on that one. So, right here we've got projected revenue. So if we would have sold in November, we would have been looking at $176,525 versus April at $204,339. Now, after we take all of our costs out, what we had to pay for the distillers, the corn stalks, the trucking, all of that, labor, we put some labor in there. Basically, the check we would get at the end of the day is $21,514. So it paid. Okay, so the return on investment for this is 3.19%. So then Rob said, well, what if we throw them out on grass for another 2 months and we don't sell them until June? So we have all of our input costs to get us through April with the distillers and corn stalks, but now we're gonna add the cost of grass in. We have additional labor, we have some more vet. So this ends up being $15,372 for your return on investment. Oh, I'm sorry. Just for those, that's the cost, 15,000 for that extra 2 months. Projected profit and loss after the change in revenue, is 21,000. So we put another 100 pounds on these calves in that 2 months. Our price, our futures price remained about the same, it was close, at $253.50. And so we actually have a little high, we're gonna make a little more money this way, and our return is almost 10%, okay? So this depicts it a little better, it was easier to break down for me. So revenue, if we sold in November, 176, April, 204, June, 229. You see our costs there, it's about another $10,000 for us to hold them for those other extra 2 months. But our profit and loss changed quite a bit. Now, there's considerations you'd wanna make. I don't know that right now I'd be gambling that I was gonna have grass in June. But if you've had got a ton of snow or whatever, and you know you're going to, it's something to consider for sure. So the biggest thing, when I was talking to Rob about this, is just looking at all the markets, not just zeroing in on one, because maybe next year it's actually gonna pay more for us to sell them in April, even though historically we wait and hold them until June, okay? So it's not cookie cutter every year. Okay, just to wrap everything up, all backgrounding is a chance to add value to your calves in an affordable manner. If feed's through the roof and calves are in the tank, probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if it's a favorable year, and the market timing's right, it could really benefit you in your operation, okay? Source feeds and know how to balance your feed price with feed value. So I use the term, we wanna do this as efficiently as possible. You want cheap gains, right? Now that is, Dagan pretty well told you, do not go buy straw, do not buy junk, molded hay, whatnot, and try to have these calves be miracle workers and gain a ton of weight on them. We still have to provide a good product to them, but source what's the most economical, right? If distillers' grains and corn are super expensive this year, that's probably not the best choice. But if your neighbor's got corn stalks for really cheap, and you can get a hold of some protein, it could be a good idea. Vaccinate and consider growth promotants. A lot of producers leave money on the table with implants and ionophores. They are not widely used anywhere in the industry, not just Wyoming. It's starting to come up, but it's something to really look at. Yes, you have to run those calves through the chute, you've gotta buy implants, you've gotta put them in. But if you're looking at a $15 increase per dollar you put in, it could really make a lot of sense. Learn to develop a ration that marries affordability with effective growth. Ration balancing is not easy, it is confusing, there's a million numbers on that page. Dagan and I are here, Chance is also great with some ration balancing, so reach out, we'll help you, we'll teach you, whatnot, but it's something to pay attention to as you're feeding any livestock species, but pay attention what's affordable and what's gonna help them gain. And then be able to break the numbers down to find the ideal time to sell. We're not just throwing feed at calves and then throwing them on a truck. We need to evaluate when is the best time to market them and how to market them, okay? Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
2 screens before that, does that include labor?
This one?
Yeah, the 21,320.
Yeah, so our labor's right, both the April versus June, we evaluated labor for both, yes.
What was your projected gain on November through April? I'm sorry, I missed that.
What do we got here? Moving from 575 to 802, so 225.
Okay.
So
You were putting 800 pounders back out on grass and
It-
expecting them to keep gaining?
yeah, with a protein source, yes. Anybody else? All right, thank you guys. If you do have any questions for the day, Dagan and I will be here as well as Rob.
Thank you.
That's going to be.
I can take a picture.
What are you feeding them?
Your face.